The silence in the crowded convention hall was not the polite, anticipatory quiet of an audience waiting for a speech to begin. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness, born of shock and profound respect. Hundreds of people, a mix of military personnel, veterans, and civilian medical professionals, sat frozen in their seats. Their eyes were locked on the slight figure standing at the podium, a woman in her early 30s with a messy bun, wearing the crisp uniform of a Navy lieutenant. She wasn't tall, and she didn't look imposing. In fact, she looked exhausted. But the emblem on her chest, the golden eagle clutching a trident, proclaimed to everyone in the room that she was one of an elite few, a Navy SEAL. For the past 10 minutes, the audience had been listening to a panel discussion on battlefield trauma care. The panelists, all men with impressive credentials, had been discussing theories and protocols. Then, during the Q&A session, a young man in the back had asked a question that seemed to annoy the moderator. He wanted to know about the psychological cost of triage, about the moment a medic has to decide who lives and who dies when the bullets are still flying. The moderator had deflected, offering a textbook answer about clinical detachment. That's when the woman with the tired eyes had leaned into her microphone. "With all due respect," she had said, her voice quiet but clear as a bell, "there's nothing clinical about holding a 19-year-old's intestines in your hands while praying to a God you're not sure you believe in." The room had gone silent instantly. Now, encouraged by the panel moderator, who looked both terrified and fascinated, she was about to do something she had never done before. She was about to tell them exactly who she was. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, she began, and she had been a Navy SEAL for 11 years. But she wasn't going to talk about the high-speed raids or the night jumps. She was there to talk about the quiet. Specifically, the quiet of a medevac helicopter. She described the sound of the rotors, a rhythmic thumping that was usually deafening. But somehow, when you were looking at a wounded soldier, the world seemed to mute. She told the audience about her first real test, not in training, but in the Shuri Valley of Afghanistan in 2012. Her team had been inserted to clear a village, but the intel was bad. They walked straight into a horseshoe ambush. Within the first 60 seconds of the firefight, her point man was down. But she had run through a wall of dirt kicked up by machine gun fire to get to him. She didn't think about it. She just moved. She dragged him behind a small rock outcropping and got to work. The wound was a femoral bleed, one of the worst things you can see in the field. She packed the wound, applied pressure, and started an IV, all while bullets whizzed past her head, so close she could feel the wind on her cheeks. That was the first time she realized that being a SEAL medic meant fighting two wars at once, one against the enemy and one against the clock, using just her 2 hands and a small aid bag. The audience leaned forward, not wanting to miss a word. She paused for a moment, taking a sip of water, and the simple act seemed to echo in the silent hall. She moved on to the second part of her story, which happened just 2 hours after the first. The ambush was still ongoing and the team was pinned down, taking fire from 3 different directions. The corpsman from the attached Army unit had been hit in the shoulder and couldn't continue. Sarah got the call on the radio. 2 casualties, 1 American, 1 Afghan interpreter, in a shallow ditch 50 meters ahead. To get to them, she had to cross a stretch of open ground that the enemy had zeroed in on. Her team leader grabbed her arm and told her to wait for smoke cover. She remembered looking at him and shaking her head. "They don't have that kind of time," she said. She dropped her heavy rucksack, kept only her medical kit and her sidearm, and ran. She didn't run in a straight line. She ran in the zigzag pattern that was drilled into them during training, kicking up dust with every step. The world became a tunnel. She could hear the cracks of bullets passing by, but she didn't flinch. When she slid into the ditch, she landed right next to the interpreter. He was conscious, his eyes wide with terror. He had a sucking chest wound. She could hear the air whistling out of his side with every labored breath. She ripped open an occlusive dressing, taped it down on 3 sides to create a valve, and immediately turned to the American soldier. His injuries were even worse. Shrapnel had torn into his neck and his lower abdomen. As she worked, she talked to them. She told the interpreter he was going to be fine, that he was brave, that his family was waiting for him. She told the soldier about her favorite pizza place back in Virginia Beach. She talked about anything to keep them conscious, to keep them fighting. She worked in that ditch for 45 minutes, exposed to the sun and the sporadic enemy fire, stabilizing them for the extraction that couldn't come fast enough. As the afternoon sun began to shift in the convention hall's large windows, Sarah's voice grew even softer. The audience had to strain to hear her, but no one dared to cough or shuffle their feet. She told them about the call that changed everything, the mission that earned her the nickname the Ghost among her team, not because she was sneaky, but because she seemed to have 9 lives. It was a night raid on a high-value target compound in a different province. The insertion was supposed to be quiet, but the dogs started barking the moment their boots hit the ground. The breach was chaotic. Her team flowed into the compound like water, she clearing rooms with practiced precision. But the intelligence had missed a secondary force holed up in a basement. When the shooting started, it was at point-blank range. Sarah was right behind the breacher when he took a round to his helmet, the force of it spinning him around and knocking him unconscious. She dragged him into a corner and checked his vitals. He was alive, just dazed. But then she heard the call over the radio. "Man down! Medic up!" One of her best friends, an operator named Mike, had been hit in the throat while clearing the basement stairs. She moved toward the sound of gunfire, stepping over debris and spent shell casings. When she found Mike, she knew it was bad. The bullet had nicked his carotid artery. He was drowning in his own blood. She did something she had only done in training. She found the bleeder. He clamped it and performed an emergency cricothyroidotomy right there on the dirty floor, inserting a tube into his windpipe to allow him to breathe. While she worked, another SEAL stood over them, firing his rifle at the door where the enemy was trying to push through. The roar of the gun was deafening, but Sarah's hands were steady. She got his airway secured just as the assault force cleared the rest of the compound. Mike's eyes fluttered open and looked at her. He couldn't speak because of the tube, but he squeezed her hand. That squeeze, she said, was the fuel that kept her going for the next 5 years. The story took a darker turn as she recounted the aftermath of that successful raid. They had secured the compound and were waiting for the extraction helicopter. The team was buzzing with the adrenaline of a hard win. Mike was stable, loaded on a stretcher. Sarah was sitting against a wall, letting the corpsman from the helicopter take over, when she heard a sound that didn't fit. A single shot followed by screaming. A hidden insurgent, one they had missed in their sweep, had popped up from a spider hole and fired blindly before being cut down. The bullet had ricocheted off a wall and hit their Afghan interpreter, a young man named Hamid, who had been with them for 6 months and had become like a brother to them. Sarah ran again. She found Hamid lying on his back, a small hole just above his body armor. It was a clean shot, but the angle was wrong. The bullet had traveled downward. She knew immediately that it had nicked his spine. As she worked on him, trying to stop the internal bleeding she couldn't see, she looked into his eyes. He was scared. Anna, but he was trying to be brave. He whispered to her in broken English, "Doc, tell my mother I was good. Tell her I was brave." Sarah held his hand as he slipped away. It was the first patient she had ever lost. She had to radio in the KIA, Killed in Action report. She had to zip him into a bag. She had to get back on the helicopter and fly home with his body. She told the audience that the quietest moment she ever experienced wasn't in a library or a church. It was on that helicopter, flying through the dark night, sitting next to the body of a friend covered in his blood, while everyone else stared at the floor. Sarah looked up from the podium, and the audience could see the glisten of tears she was fighting to hold back. This was the part she hated talking about, the part that made her feel weak. But she had started the story, and she felt compelled to finish it. She talked about coming home, about the 1,000-yard stare that her husband noticed but was too afraid to mention, about the nightmares where she could never get to Hamid in time, where her feet moved through molasses. She was a highly decorated combat veteran, a woman who had proven herself in the most masculine environment on earth, and yet she couldn't handle a trip to the grocery store without having a panic attack if someone dropped a can of beans behind her. The sound was too much like a gunshot. She isolated herself. She stopped returning calls from her teammates. She drank alone at night, just enough to sleep, just enough to quiet the noise in her head. She felt like a fraud. How could she be a hero when she had failed to save Hamid? How could she be strong when she was falling apart? As she went to the Veterans Affairs Hospital, but the waiting room was crowded and the fluorescent lights buzzed and she felt trapped. She left before they called her name. It was her husband who finally saved her, not with a grand gesture but with simple persistence. He sat her down one night and said, "Sarah, I didn't marry a SEAL. I married you, and I miss you. Please come back to me." That was the first crack in the armor. That was the first time she cried in years. She decided to get help, not from the VA at first, but from a private therapist who specialized in trauma. It was slow, painful work. She had to unpack every memory, every death, every close call. She had to forgive herself for Hamid. She had to realize that being a good medic wasn't about saving everyone. It was about trying to save everyone. Like about fighting like hell until the very last second. She started going to group therapy sessions with other veterans. At first, she didn't speak. She just listened. She listened to young infantrymen talk about the same nightmares she had. She listened to a female veteran talk about the same isolation she felt. She realized she wasn't alone. She wasn't a freak. She was human. She started running again, not for training, but for the pure joy of feeling her heart pound. She started volunteering at a free clinic, just suturing cuts and treating colds. But it reminded her why she had become a medic in the first place. It reminded her that she loved to heal. The final part of her story brought the audience full circle. And she had been invited to the convention by a former commanding officer who knew she was now working as a physician's assistant in a busy civilian emergency room. He thought her perspective would be valuable, and it was, but not in the way anyone expected. Sarah Jenkins concluded her story by addressing the young man who had asked the original question. She told him that the psychological cost of triage was the weight of every face you couldn't save. But the reward, the thing that made it bearable, was the face of the one you did. She told him that she wasn't standing there because she was a hero. She was standing there because she was a survivor. She was standing there because of the team that had her back, the husband who held her hand, and the patients who trusted her with their lives. She looked out at the sea of faces, and many of them now openly crying. The silence returned, but it was different this time. It was a silence of reverence. She smiled, a real, genuine smile, and said, "So, the next time you see a quiet person in uniform, don't ask them how many people they've killed. Ask them how many people they've loved. The answer might surprise you." And with that, she stepped back from the podium, nodded once, and sat down. The hall erupted in applause, a thunderous standing ovation that lasted for nearly 5 minutes. But Sarah just sat there looking down at her hands, the same hands that had held the wounded and the dying, the same hands that had learned to heal.